Hello YouTubers and welcome to another episode of the vlogs. Today, as you can tell from the title, we're talking a little bit about rowing machines. Like yesterday we talked about rowing on the water versus rowing on the rowing machine. Today it's about sort of the dynamic ergs versus the static ergs. You've got the row perfect, you've got the concept 2, you've got the concept 2 dynamic. Why would you use one of them over the other? I'm going to have a chat about that, but first things first, I've got to finish off my smoothie, get into the club, get warmed up and get on to the first session of the day because we're running into Henley Royal Regatta and time is running short as time moves forward. So there is only a limited amount of time, I think 27 days until Henley Royal Regatta starts, as work continues to be done there behind me. And good news, I will be able to do a tour around the regatta because I will have a pass because I'm working with the company that does social media for Henley Royal Regatta. So that's awesome, and it hopefully will give a little bit of more access for the vlogs, but it's more about sort of helping them out and then seeing if I can do anything else on here. But now let's get into the club. Oh, you! And we've made it off the water after a lovely session in the Arctubal. Just gonna wait on breakfast. So while we're waiting to fuel up after the session, we're in erg room, we're on the static machine to discuss a little bit about the static rowing machine and why this is a good machine to have, or why it's a good machine to use. I think two of the biggest reasons to use this machine is pretty much everyone who rows has used it, everyone who has sort of the world records, everyone who wants to compare themselves to anyone else, whether that's national team people or, like I said, people with world records, then the concept 2 static rowing machine is the thing to use. Obviously that could change in time, but this is the machine for that. On top of sort of the comparison to many different people, a big thing about the row machine is the reliability of the machine itself. So we have more than 10 ergs here, more than 15 ergs or so here.
and they don't really fail, especially if you take care of them, especially if you lube the chain a little bit, keep them nice and clean. These machines last a ridiculous amount of time, and even when they need a little bit of maintenance, it's not that big of a deal. There's a few screws to remove here and there, a bit of elastic, and then the batteries that might need replaced every so often. But that is it for the maintenance, and then usually you hop on an erg, you adjust the fan, you get that number, and every erg is pretty much the same, or you can make it feel the same. What might change is, say, an 8 on one erg on a new erg might be a 10 on an older erg, but that's down to sort of the maintenance of that erg. If you keep it well maintained, the drag factor, that number on the fan, will be pretty similar. It'll stay steady throughout the whole life of the machine. But drag factor is a whole nother video. I've made a couple of those already, but maybe I'll make a separate video talking about drag factor specifically. But that's two advantages for the static rowing machine, and one disadvantage is versus a dynamic ergs, versus a row perfect, or versus a dynamic C2, is the fact that it is static. It is such a sort of numb machine. So you can do things, so say we're doing a rate 20, 30 minute, you can haul on the chain and really sort of lean back and have technique that when you do that on the water is going to upset the boat. And since we're doing a sport of rowing, you want to have the best technique that's applicable to rowing itself, not to the machine. But you might be doing sort of erg competitions, and then you can fire in technique that will help you on the rowing machine. But usually the technique that helps and gives you that little bit of an extra, sort of maybe half split to a split, generally doesn't really help on the water. So the rowing machine takes a big sort of chunk of its speed from the length of the drive. So if you can, some people, you can see that they're bringing it all the way up here above, sort of above the chest, and sometimes I've even seen people bring it to the neck. That does generate some speed, but it can also sort of cause or increase the likelihood of injuries to sort of the back, the core, etc. But that's what happens when you're really trying to strive for those little bits, those little bit of extra speed on the erg, and then you can't do that on the water. So that's the biggest disadvantage. It is a numb machine and isn't so applicable to sort of the technique on the water. Obviously, you can sort of really focus on the technique that you might apply, but there is not a lot going on. There is barely any external factors that affect you on the rowing machine that affect you on the water. But now, since we've spoke about the static machine, we'll speak about the dynamic machines, sort of the row perfect and the dynamic C2. Obviously, there are other options out there, but those are the three that I've had quite a lot of experience with. But we'll talk about that after, probably after the second session and after breakfast. We need to get some fuel, because remember, food is fuel. And we've made it into the crew room today, fueling up after a little bit of a chat on the rowing machine and after the session on the water. We've got Mary here.
Hello.
Hello. And we've got some breaded egg toast because it's absolutely delicious. Barney, how was the session?
Really, really hot.
Oh yeah! Barney was really mentally working on his stroke today. Very well done, Barney. But we've got the breaded egg toast. We've got to fuel up after every single session, because you have to stay fueled, to stay motivated, to stay positive, to stay alive. So we're going to continue fueling up, and then something else.
made it into the aquarium to fuel up after the session on the water, because remember, food is fuel. And then we'll discuss about static ergs versus the dynamics, or why you might use a dynamic erg or a row perfect over the static, disadvantages and advantages of those. But let's fuel up first. And we've made it outside of the club for another day to finish off the day. We're going to talk about dynamic ergs, why you should use them over static ones, or why you should use static ones over dynamic ergs. So I've used the row perfect quite a lot. I've used the dynamic C2s quite a bit, so I'm going to be talking about those versus the static erg. But the biggest advantage for both of them is the fact that it's more like rowing itself. So the row perfect is quite close to the motion of on a boat, so you're pushing with the legs and you're a lot of things moving on the machine itself. The dynamic is more about the legs, I would say, which is bringing it into the sort of how you want to row on the water in a leg dominated stroke. So both machines bring the technique into a sort of less numb state, like I mentioned about the static erg, and more into the technique that you want to be using when you're on the water. So that is probably the biggest advantage, and the edge of that goes probably to the row perfect. And then so in the middle it would be the dynamic C2, and then a row perfect would be best. I've also used a lot of different contraptions as well, sort of can't remember the name, but there's like a something slider. It's an actual full machine, not the actual sliders themselves on the C2. The sliders, I think, still, yes, they add a little bit of movement, but it's still quite numb. Like the same, once you get used to the movement, you can start adding things in that don't necessarily help on the water, which you can still do on the row perfect and the dynamic C2. Big disadvantage for those machines though is they are a lot more fragile. So with the rowing machine, you have the static C2, you have the minimal amount, or out of all of the machines, you have the smallest amount of moving parts. So when you start adding moving parts, you start adding the likelihood that something is going to fail. And so I've seen more maintenance done to sort of the row perfects and the dynamic C2s than on a static C2. That may be because people are very used to using C2s, and may just be they're all very the same on that level. But in my experience, the row perfects are the most fragile out of the three that we're talking about, and the sort of the dynamics in between the two. I've seen that, so there's no chain with the dynamic C2s. It's like a rope. I've seen that rope snap. I've never seen a chain snap on an erg. I've seen a handle snap, but the same handle on the on the two Concept 2 machines. And then you go to the row perfect. The rail itself tends to bend. That might be because I'm used to using it with a bunch of heavy guys and they've not thought about 100 kilos bouncing up and down. And then the cogs inside the machine, there's a lot more moving parts inside those row perfects, so there is a lot more to go wrong. So if they aren't really, really well maintained, then it's just a downward slope that could perhaps end up with the machine breaking. So at university we used those C2s, so the row perfects, and we ended up not being able to rate too high or pull too hard or do starts, because when we would do starts, the machines would give way essentially, and we'd miss parts of the cog. And here is Mr. Robson. So I'm discussing Robson static ergs. I've said about how they're very reliable. And if you want to compare, they're really good to compare, but they're very numb. And I've said about dynamic, how they're a bit less, so dynamic C2 and the row perfect, they're less numb, but very fragile. Your thoughts on the machines?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the static one puts a bit more weight on your, on your body, so your lower back is a bit more stress going through there, just because you're having to move your body up to the catch and then change direction and fly back. it's hard to compare between the two, as in like scores and stuff, because you can rate so much higher on a road perfect. I know the Dutch team do all their testing on a road perfect, and that's fine if they all do it. But it's tough to be like, oh well, I've done a 2k at this on a road perfect, and it's like, yeah, but you can rate 4 pips higher and get away with it because it's just light and you can tap it along a bit more. So I think like if you're doing long mileage training, the road perfect is better for injury prevention, and if you've got a weak back as it is, use the road perfect. The other thing I quite like about them is they're really narrow, so that they're a bit like a boat, so you kind of have to balance it. You can just kind of sit there on an erg and get away with it. But I'd love to train on road perfects. I think they're really nice.
So we have a fan of the row perfects here, and like I also like the row perfects as well, but the amount that went wrong with my experience in the row perfects maybe have tainted my experience a little bit. But as Robson mentioned, thank you very much, Robson, as he mentioned, the injury prevention sort of thing is massive. So what I've seen happen is we'll go on the static, and then some people will have some back problems, and then they'll move to a dynamic machine and have no issues. So like Robson's saying, there is a difference in those machines where it's just a bit less stress on the body, especially when you're doing higher mileages. But that is it for today's discussion. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I had a few people asking yesterday about the sort of differences between the dynamic ergs and the static ergs after doing the video about rowing on the water versus rowing on a static machine. Just trying to do something a little bit different as well. So hopefully you guys did enjoy it, and let me know in the comments below what you think about sort of the static machines versus dynamic machines, your favorite machines, and maybe if there's other machines that you've used that you think are better. I've used sort of the oar simulators, I've used the gamut sort of big metal contraptions that attach to the side of a C2. I've used further sliders and whatnot, but maybe there's others out there that you think they are better than anything I have mentioned. But that will be it for today. And as always, Yam Squad, remember to subscribe if you haven't already, hit that like button, and I will see you tomorrow.